Most of this rapid change that we've been discussing in the post-World War II era, specifically the 1960s, has had much to do with politics. Today, what I want to do is transition that into culture. You're going to see a lot of transition when it comes to American culture as well. What you're looking at here, guys, would be the first ever human be-in, which was held in San Francisco in its Golden Gate Park in 1967. Really, what you need to understand about this is that this is America's introduction to hippies. Um, I want you to think about that word here for just a second. My guess is you've heard it before. You might even have an image or an example in the forefront of your mind. But hippies are really going to come to the fore in the mid to late 1960s, and they're going to be at the helm of this cultural war in the United States. So, with that being said, what I want to do is begin this conversation. Hippies are what you and I would call the counterculture. Now, it's important that you understand that nobody used this term counterculture until the 1970s at the very earliest. But generally, what we mean is this rejection of middle class values, middle class conformity that was really the social expectation of the 1950s. The concept that you would grow up and that you would marry your high school sweetheart, you'd get a very, stable job, and you'd settle down, have kids, and that would sort of be the way that your life would flow. The counterculture is not only questioning that, the validity of all of that, in many ways it's rejecting it. Counterculture is also at the helm of this rejection of rigid social norms, including but not limited to things like segregation, the Cold War consensus. On the flip side of the coin, the counterculture embraces the notions of women's rights, social diversity, and more importantly than anything else, independent thinking. Okay, as their mantra would later come to be known, never trust anybody over the age of 30. The ancestors, the cultural ancestors of the hippies, we've actually talked about them in this class, and that would be the beatniks. There's a really major difference, and I'll tell you what that difference is here at the end, well, at the end of this slide. But for right now, understand the beatniks were these cultural dissenters. They were really laughing at, mocking that culture of conformity of the 1950s, not necessarily trying to destroy it. They experimented with recreational drugs, alternative forms of sexuality, Eastern customs, Eastern religions. You'll see this manifest itself in American mainstream culture. Probably the best example that I can give you would be the beatnik writer J.D. Salinger, who wrote this book that I'm sure you're very familiar with, The Catcher in the Rye. The big difference between the beatniks and the hippies is going to be that the beatniks, for all intents and purposes, are going to be underground, and for the most part, they're going to remain underground in places like Greenwich Village, New York, and San Francisco as well. The other main difference is the hippies, unlike their beatnik ancestors, they're not just going to laugh at society. In various ways, they're going to try to change and destroy certain realms of American culture. Before we go any further, guys, there's three tenets of the counterculture that I need you to be mindful of. The first one would be the free love movement, okay? Um, Contrary to popular belief, not very many hippies read, but the very few that did read this guy by the name of Norman A. Brown, who wrote this book called Life Against Death. And it just kind of became the Bible of the counterculture movement when it comes to free love. And what Brown is going to argue in that piece is that the great tragedy of man is that he can only know real happiness by indulging his bodily impulses, and the problem with that are there's certain social rules and expectations that will simply not allow for that. Mainly, this involves human sexuality. And so one of the things that the counterculture is going to rebel against is the institution of marriage, generally speaking. Now, I want you to think about what marriage is. Those of you that are married, you'll know that you need one of these. And when you get married, you'll know that you need one of these. And of course, what that is a marriage license. And where you get the marriage license, it's not the church, it's not the chapel or anything like that. It would be the courthouse. Because at the end of the day, what marriage is a contract. It's a contract between two people, right? Which is why you take that contract to a court if you ever want to have it dissolved. Well, the hippies rejected marriage primarily because they felt that love as an institution ought to be entered into freely without the coercion of contract. And so, this is one realm of why the hippies are rebelling against the institution of marriage. They felt that you should be free to love whomever you pleased, and you didn't need a contract to do that. And similarly, you should be able to express that love physically. There is a sexual aspect to this free love movement because the hippies are going to view the institution of sexuality more or less as a human right. The problem is you're never going to have this human right that will extend to women unless you have birth control. And in the early 1960s, we get really one of the more effective forms of birth control, and that would be the pill. And so you see this connection between the free love movement and this cultural war that's erupting. Because if you think back to the lectures in the 1950s and the early post-war period, the sexuality that was discussed openly at all, and I'm being very broad about that term, it was basically heterosexual male sexuality. And so this was a very taboo topic, the idea of female sexuality. And it's another one of the reasons why the hippies were coming after these institutions, especially marriage. Because ultimately what the free love movement was arguing was that this institution of uh, looking down upon premarital sex, they saw that as repressive and regressive. In general, what the free love movement was all about was a full scale rebellion against what they considered to be civilized sexuality. And of course, what they meant by that was sex in the bounds of wedlock. The next um, tenet of the counterculture movement that I want you to be mindful of would be recreational drugs. Many people will tell you that the hippie drug of choice was marijuana. It was not. It was actually LSD, street name acid. And the guy that's going to bring LSD to the masses and really kind of make it the hippie drug of choice is a very unlikely individual. A Harvard psychologist by the name of Timothy Leary. Leary was your prototypical goody two shoes before he had ingested hallucinogenic drugs while on vacation early on in his career. Now, you have to understand that this is a guy that understands very well how the human brain works, and he's deeply interested in this. And when he went on this hallucinogenic trip, for him, this was a conscious raising experience. That what this was able to do for the human brain is get it to use more of its brain. It was a way of lifting the veil, as he put it. In short, drugs could help broaden one's mind and have a more holistic experience within the world. So when he got back to Harvard, what he did is he encouraged his graduate students, people that had fought tooth and nail to get to Cambridge and study under elite scholars like himself. He encouraged them to drop out. He encouraged them to take drugs, and he encouraged them to think a lot more broadly about where they were going with their lives. But I need you to understand that what Timothy Leary is going to do is he's going to really provide this drug culture to this countercultural movement. This is about being more in touch with one's subconsciousness in that particular capacity. It's going to be Ken Kesey that will marry this hallucinogenic drug culture to the rock and roll psychedelic style. There's really no great way of putting this, so I'll just put it this way. Ken Kesey was a leader of this I don't really want to call them a cult, but generally speaking, what they were a band of hippies that got high together, they partied together, they all slept with one another. They called themselves the Merry Pranksters. And what the Merry Pranksters did was team up with the quintessential hippie band of the movement, and that would be the Grateful Dead, who were never very successful commercially, but everybody within the hippie social sphere knew of them, and they would play these really loud, frenzied sound shows in parking lots and farmer fields. And while they were out there on stage and they were playing, Ken Kesey would be out in the audience and he would be handing out free acid, called it the Great Acid Test. And that's where people would say that they could taste the sounds or they could hear the colors. And you see this psychedelic style merging with the third tenet of the counterculture movement, and of course, that would be rock and roll. Now, if you've been with us for a while here and watching these video lectures, you know that rock and roll was not something that was invented in the late 1960s. It had been around really since the 1950s. We talked about Elvis Presley. But the difference between the 60s and when rock and roll first emerges is it assumes an unmistakable anti-authoritarian sentiment by the mid-1960s. You have bands like Jefferson Airplane, The Doors, the Rolling Stones, Buffalo Springfield. I mean, even the Beatles had really begun to transition in terms of their brand of music. But it's really going to be a guy by the name of Robert Zimmerman, who's going to take the stage name of Bob Dylan, that is going to be sort of seen as the voice of the generation. He's going to write some very prolific songs. In ways, guys, he's not that much different than when we were talking about Woody Guthrie providing a soundtrack for the Great Depression. In so many ways, Bob Dylan provided a soundtrack for the 1960s. Whether you want to spin that in the context of Vietnam or you want to spin that in the context of the times changing, no pun intended. In any case, rock and roll is really going to assume this very question authority, anti-authoritarian sort of attitude in the late 1960s. The hippie capital of the country was San Francisco, and to be even more precise, it's the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco. Um, at the beginning of this lecture, I asked you to kind of think of somebody that you would use as an example of a hippie, and generally speaking, I don't know if you're like me, but generally speaking, the people that I think of are all individuals that come from a really middle class background, some cases even upper middle class background. Uh, but really, the mantra of hippiedom is poverty. And so, generally speaking, what you've got is these middle class kids that are pretending to be poor, or at least embracing, celebrating this impoverished lifestyle. Now, the hippie event of the 1960s is going to come in 1967 in what comes to be known as the Summer of Love. This is when you see the Monterey Pop Festival, massive music show. You see free food, free drugs as these flower children descend into the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco. One of my favorites, you see the free clinic. You see some of these hippie doctors, taking up storefront practices, these abandoned storefronts in San Francisco, and they would treat these very treatable diseases for the people of the community. They would essentially set up health care for the masses. And like I said before, the 1967 Summer of Love is going to become the hippie cultural event of the era. Okay, and it's going to be downhill from here. If you were to ask most Americans when did the hippie movement, the counterculture movement, sort of peak, they'd probably point to the 1969 music festival known as Woodstock. Woodstock's a very good example, but if you know what you're talking about, you'll be able to tell me that the counterculture was in full retreat by 1969 for a lot of different reasons. Number one, to the people on the left, the new left that kind of got immersed in this cultural movement. You could kind of see how and why they might be attracted to people questioning the culture of America at the time. The problem is this is going to serve as a political handicap. It's kind of hard to go out there and organize if you're SDS when you're half baked. Okay. You also see pretty authoritarian repression, or authority repression, um, similar to drugs like crack or meth today. LSD was big news in the 1960s, and you begin to see a lot of narcotics officers out undercover, beginning to crack down on some of these people that are selling. And when drugs became harder to get, the quality of them went down. I'll give you a very infamous example of that here in just a second. But generally speaking, what you're going to see are various elements of this counterculture that really begin to fail. A lot of people misinterpreted, sometimes on purpose, this free love movement to as an excuse to be promiscuous. And all too often, the free love movement failed, and it resulted in a series of one night stands and sexually transmitted diseases. You also saw the dark side of drugs. If you're looking at the PowerPoint presentation with me, the guy at the top of the screen, that'd be Charles Manson, who is a leader of one of these drug communes in in California. And he was not alone in this. In many ways, Ken Kesey was similar to this. But at the end of the day, what Charles Manson really was a very effective pimp. He had numerous women that lived with him, all of whom he put out to various men. And like any effective controller of people, he manipulated their brains, and he generally did this through drugs. And these people are ultimately going to go on a killing spree around about this period, and it's going to show the darker side of drugs. When they tried Charles Manson, they don't try him for murder. He wasn't guilty of murder. It was conspiracy to commit murder. But the dark side of drugs, what these women did were just plain strange. They shaved their heads, they would stand up in the middle of the trial and give these weird salutes, and all of this painted these people that were advocating for turning on and tuning in and dropping out. It painted the Learys of the world in a very bad light. And so naturally, love has failed and drugs have failed. That leaves rock and roll, right? And you're going to see the darker side of rock and roll as the decade rounds itself out as well. At the bottom of the screen there, what you're looking at is a photo from the Altamont Festival in San Francisco. San Francisco's answer to Woodstock was the Altamont Festival, and one of the things that they did to bring people out was to get the headline band, arguably the biggest band in the world at the time, that'd be the Rolling Stones. They also learned a lot from the mistakes of Woodstock. If you know anything about that event, part of the reason that it was seen as such a successful event was that it was actually free. It was not meant to be free, but they had not anticipated the massive amount of crowds that were going to pour into upstate New York. And in the end, they had a decision to make. You either ask the bands to play for free or you tell everybody to go home, and you know which decision that they made. And so the lesson that Altamont learned from Woodstock was you got to have crowd control, which means that you're going to have security. And so what the organizers of Altamont did in their infinite wisdom is they hired a motorcycle gang by the name of the Hells Angels. And they didn't pay them in cash, certainly didn't go down the road of direct deposit. What they did is they paid them in beer. You don't have to be a criminologist to see what's going to happen next. You've got angry bikers, you've got rowdy crowds, and you've got beer. What you're looking at there, that collection of Hell's Angels surrounding what is a fallen body, as the crowd pushed up to get closer and closer to the band, one of these Hell's Angels took out a switchblade and just stabbed him right in the midsection. And so you saw the darker side of rock and roll as well. And it's going to lead a lot of these people that were involved in the counterculture in one way or another to kind of assume that they didn't really achieve very much. Historians have been kinder to the counterculture than I think the counterculture was to itself. I think, as a historian, that one of the more basic things that the counterculture was able to achieve was a popular critique of authority, to think independently for oneself, as opposed to if your teacher, if your pastor, if your professor, if your elder said it was so, then by goodness, that was the way that it was. It was so, right? The idea of never trusting anybody over the age of 30 might have sounded a little bit funny, but in any case, what this is going to do is it's going to encourage people to think on their own. You're also going to see a celebration of diversity. Um, we don't really see this celebration of diversity. Whether you're thinking about this from the perspective of food, whether you're thinking about this from the perspective of culture, if you walk around our campus for long enough, you'll see some events on the campus that celebrate various cultural issues, whether they be holidays or music or food or languages or what have you. We see this as a good thing. Americans at the late 1940s, early 1950s did not. The idea of speaking a foreign language or eating something as innocent and simple as pizza was considered to be kind of different. And the last thing that you wanted to be in the 1950s is different, because to be different was to be a little bit suspicious. Not a very good time to be suspicious, right? But more than anything else, and if you don't get anything else in your notes other than this, I want this in your notes. What the counterculture managed to achieve was a relaxation of American culture. Okay, what I mean by that is you begin to see a loosening of American culture, generally speaking. The idea being that anybody that wore jeans and a t-shirt or a hooded sweatshirt or something like this. Back when I was in college, sometimes people would come down from their dorm still in their pajamas, and they'd be there in class in their pajamas. And that would not be something that you'd ever dream of doing in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. College, university, that was something that needed to be taken very, very serious. And you were expected to dress the part. Now, I used higher education. You could easily use religious worship. Think about some of the things that you see in services and masses and religious worship generally speaking. You do see a general relaxation of American life, and it really does begin in the 1960s with this counterculture movement. Last example, the sexual revolution. Okay, probably not what you're thinking of. It's a relaxation of sexual values and sexual mores. Again, probably not what you're thinking, although it does become less and less taboo for a woman to have a child out of wedlock. Premarital sex in the aftermath of the 1960s takes on far, far less of a loaded issue than it had before that period. I guess maybe one way to say it is sexuality becomes much more open and discussed much more openly than it had in the 1950s. I'm not saying that premarital sex did not happen before the 60s, and I'm certainly not saying that people did not have children out of wedlock. I'm just simply saying that it was not talked about, and certainly issues like homosexuality was not talked about, and that's something that is really loosened up. It's relaxed in this sexual revolution. Okay, that's really where I wanted to leave it. And you're going to see all of these things that we've been discussing: the radicalization of the civil rights movement, the explosion of the anti-war movement, the absolute mess that the Democratic Party is in by 1968, and of course now you've got this counterculture, which is nothing short of shocking to most of what you and I would consider to be Middle America. All of these things are going to converge in 1968. And you'll see what I mean the next time we meet. For right now, hope you're having a good one.